This is what rugby league looked like 50 years ago.
In rugby league, sportsmanship is everything.
And this is what it looks like now.
Queensland again to open the try scoring.
So how did we get here? Well, it all started back in the late 1800s when rugby union was the sole rugby code, but there was a huge class divide between the clubs in the north and south of England. You see, the southerners played for leisure and wanted to keep it that way, but the northerners were working 6 days a week in hard labour jobs like coal miners and rail workers, and they started pushing for broken time payments for losing work for playing the game. But the professionalisation of the game continued to get dismissed and then formally rejected in 1893. 2 years later, in 1895, after receiving the support from Lancashire clubs, the northern clubs met at the George Hotel in Huddersfield to break away from the Rugby Football Union and form the Northern Union. Lancashire and Yorkshire leagues were formed in 1896. The Challenge Cup was created and would become one of the top sporting events in the country. There's 10 segments to this story, and next up we go the 1900s. The start of the 20th century saw the sport establish itself, starting with some key rule changes, reducing teams from 15 to 13 players, the introduction of the play the ball and less scrums and no line-outs. These changes made the game faster, more open and much more entertaining for players and spectators alike. In 1904, James Lomas became the first transferred player, moving from Bramley to Salford for £100, a landmark in professional rugby league. Internationally, England faced a combined Scottish and Welsh team, losing 3-9 in front of 6,000 spectators in Wigan. The game's reputation soon crossed hemispheres. Rugby union player Albert Baskerville heard of a Northern Union match in England that had drawn 40,000 fans. Inspired, he wrote to the Code asking if a New Zealand team could tour, an invitation that was accepted. Baskerville assembled a strong squad, including Dally Messenger and Lance Todd. The tour was a success on the field, but tragically, Baskerville contracted pneumonia on the return journey and died aged just 25. His impact on rugby league is enduring. Since 2002, test matches between England and New Zealand have been contested for the Baskerville Shield. Meanwhile, in Australia, rugby union players face similar challenges to their English counterparts. In August 1907, a meeting at Bateman's Hotel in Sydney, led by entrepreneur J.J. Giltinan, resulted in the founding of the New South Wales Rugby Football League. The inaugural season kicked off a year later. That same year, the Queensland Rugby Association was formed. Both leagues ran alongside each other as players began switching from rugby union to the professional game. The first Queensland League featured just 4 teams, while the New South Wales League began with 9, including South Sydney, who would dominate the first 3 decades of the competition, winning 10 premierships. By 1908, the first Australian team toured Great Britain. The tour proved a financial failure, leaving promoter J.J. Giltinan bankrupt, but it was significant in cementing international ties. That year also saw the first interstate matches between Queensland and New South Wales, but selection was based on residency rather than birthplace. With most players in the NSW League, New South Wales dominated these early series, leaving Queensland administrators frustrated with the perceived unfairness of the rule, a tension that would eventually fuel the state of origin concept decades later. The impact of World War I on rugby league was profound. Players from both England and Australia enlisted, and tragically, many lost their lives on the front lines. The war disrupted domestic competitions, leaving clubs to rely on teenagers, veterans, and anyone available to keep the sport alive. By 1921, the game was steadily recovering, and in 1922, the sport was officially called Rugby League, marking its distinct identity. The 1920s also saw some landmark developments. The Challenge Cup was played at Wembley for the first time, cementing its status as a premier sporting event. In Australia, Queensland Rugby League began to emerge as a real rival to New South Wales, thanks in large part to the influence of Harry Sunderland, a visionary administrator and later manager of the Australian national team. Acting on behalf of both the ARL and the RFL, he organised a match between Great Britain and Australia to be played in France as part of the 1933-34 Kangaroo Tour. This event helped spark the birth of French Rugby League, particularly in the south of France, where the sport quickly gained popularity. By the end of the 1930s, French Rugby League had exploded in growth. There were over 200 clubs, and the national team had recorded victories against both England and Wales, firmly establishing France as a serious rugby league nation and expanding the sport's international footprint. World War II left a deep mark on rugby league, with France suffering particularly severe consequences. After the country fell to Nazi Germany, the Vichy government banned rugby league, confiscated all of its assets and handed them over to rugby union, a move that would hinder the sport's development in France for decades. In England, sport was promoted as a morale booster during the conflict. Domestic competitions continued, though leagues were reorganised into regional formats due to travel restrictions and the absence of many players serving on the front lines. After the war, rugby league entered a period of unprecedented growth and excitement, often described as a golden era. Challenge Cup finals drew full capacity crowds at the National Stadium, and in 1948, the first televised final was broadcast featuring Wigan against Bradford. At the same time, the newly formed International Board began overseeing the global game, standardising rules and coordinating test series and tournaments. Meanwhile, in Australia, domestic competitions continued. By the end of the 1940s, Clive Churchill had emerged for South Sydney as one of the game's most talented fullbacks. He was set for a £10,000 move to Workington in England, but the ARL introduced a transfer ban on first-choice domestic players leaving for overseas clubs, aiming to protect the quality and competitiveness of the Australian League. The 1950s and 1960s were a period of transformation for rugby league, both on and off the field. In Australia, the game was steadily professionalising, while in England, television and growing media attention were beginning to reshape how fans experienced the sport. Clubs were finding new sources of revenue, like licensed poker machines in Australia, allowing players to focus more on rugby and elevating the standard of play. In England, the Challenge Cup continued to capture the imagination of the public. The 1954 replay between Warrington and Halifax drew an official crowd of 103,000 at Odsal Stadium, though some estimates suggest nearly 120,000 were present, witnessing Warrington claim an 8-4 victory. Around the same time, television began to expand rugby league's reach. BBC Two, under the direction of David Attenborough, launched the Floodlit Trophy, a knockout tournament for clubs with floodlights. Castleford claimed the inaugural trophy in 1965. The competition would be axed in 1979, with Hull FC claiming the final edition with a win over city rivals Hull KR. The international game started to up the gears. France hosted the first World Cup in 1954 and narrowly lost the final to Great Britain in Paris. By the end of the decade, France regularly competed with and beat Australia, Great Britain and New Zealand, proving themselves a top-tier nation and played a pivotal role in organising the first World Cup. This period also produced some of rugby league's most iconic players. In England, Brian Bevan, the legendary Warrington winger, scored over 700 tries, a record that remains unmatched, while Billy Boston became a superstar at Wigan, later earning a knighthood for his contributions to the sport. In Australia, the St George Dragons set a standard for excellence with an unprecedented 11 consecutive premierships from 1956 to 1966, defining the decade and creating a dynasty that included greats like Ken Kearney and Johnny Raper. The 1960s also saw major rule developments, including the introduction of the tackle count, initially 4 and later increased to 6 in 1971, shaping the modern style of play. Television coverage of the New South Wales Grand Final began in 1967, bringing live rugby league into homes across Australia and marking the start of the game's long relationship with broadcast media. Internationally, the 70s marked the last great hurrah for Great Britain. In 1970, the Lions defeated Australia in a thrilling Ashes series at home, featuring stars like Clive Sullivan, Roger Millward and Malcolm Riley. These matches captured the public imagination, with fierce rivalries and packed crowds giving rugby league a cultural prominence rarely seen outside its heartlands. 2 years later, Great Britain secured another major triumph in the 1972 World Cup in France, with Clive Sullivan scoring one of the great tries in the final versus Australia. These triumphs were celebrated, but they also signalled a turning point. These would be the final major victories for Great Britain in this era, as Australia began to assert dominance from the mid-70s onward, setting the stage for the balance of power in international rugby league for decades to come. Domestically, Graham Alling shocked the rugby world by admitting to taking anabolic steroids in a newspaper interview. While not illegal at the time, it raised questions about player welfare. Both Australia and Britain would introduce anti-drug policies in the 80s, though testing remained limited. The WADA code would not be adopted until the 2000s. The World Club Challenge was first introduced in 1976, with St Helens facing the eastern suburbs Roosters at the Sydney Cricket Ground. Despite a dominating 25-2 victory for the home side in front of 26,000 fans, the fixture didn't become permanent due to travel costs and scheduling. In 1979, the Dally M Medal was introduced in Australia, a Player of the Season award decided by the media for New South Wales and Queensland competitions named in honour of Dally Messenger. At this point, the Rothmans Medal remained the league's official award. The 1980s saw the official birth of some of Rugby League's fiercest contests. State of origin was official. Selection rules shifted from residency to the state where a player first played senior football, and by 1982 it had evolved into a full 3-game series, televised live. These brutal, hard-fought matches captured the nation's attention, turning players like Wally Lewis, Mal Meninga and Peter Sterling into household names. Queensland dominated early, winning 6 of the first 8 series, and Lewis, nicknamed the King, left such a mark that the Queensland Man of the Series award was later named after him, eventually becoming the overall player of the series award from 2004 onwards. The decade also brought major rule changes. Points for a try increased from 3 to 4, and the sin bin was introduced. In England, Rugby League aimed to expand beyond its northern heartlands. The first London-based club entered the First Division, which had operated a 2-tier promotion and relegation system since the 1960s. By this time, Wigan and St Helens had established themselves as the dominant forces in English club rugby league. Meanwhile, in Australia, the Parramatta Eels emerged as a powerhouse with Peter Sterling and Brett Kenny, winning 4 premierships in 6 years. The New South Wales League expanded to 14 teams by the late 1980s, and the Brisbane League had 8 clubs. The game also spread internationally. Tonga and Samoa played their first international matches, later joined by Fiji in the 1990s, while Papua New Guinea continued to cement rugby league as its national sport. In England, the Challenge Cup remained a marquee event broadcast live on the BBC. Stars like Ellery Hanley, Gary Schofield, Sean Edwards and Martin Offier dominated the headlines. While the British game was still largely semi-professional, a handful of top players were effectively full-time. Many of these stars spent the winter off-season playing in Australia, where the Australian game was predominantly full-time leagues and ahead in professionalism. By the decade's end, the gap between England and Australia was widening. Australia's dominance was clear on the international stage. They had won all 5 World Cups held from the 1970s into the 80s and 90s. The 1990s would change rugby league forever. In England, the game remained mostly semi-professional, with Wigan Warriors the notable exception. Under Maurice Lindsay, Wigan operated almost entirely full-time and dominated the Challenge Cup, winning every final from 1988 to 1995, alongside numerous league titles. Sponsorships grew, but still lagged behind Australia. Facilities were ageing, crowds were shrinking, and the game remained rooted in its northern heartlands. Meanwhile, the Australian game was thriving, stadiums were modern, crowds regularly drew 15,000 to 30,000, and star players like Brad Fittler, Alan Langer, Ricky Stewart and Laurie Daly brought a new level of excitement. Television deals and sponsorship were expanded, and the sport appeared poised for continued growth. Rugby League celebrated its centenary in 1995 with a World Cup in England and Wales, won as expected by the dominant Australian side, marking a high point for the sport on the eve of a seismic event that would soon reshape Rugby League forever. That arrived in the form of Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation. Murdoch wanted exclusive pay TV rights for the Australian game and proposed the creation of a new competition, the Super League, which would ultimately split the sport in 2. The ARL refused to cede control, triggering the Super League War, a legal and commercial battle that would reshape the game entirely. 8 Australian clubs defected to Super League, and players were lured by lucrative contracts, while the rest remained loyal to the ARL. Brad Fittler famously declared his loyalty to the ARL and signed with the Sydney Roosters, reportedly earning $600,000 per year under his new deal, after previously earning around $160,000 per season, highlighting just how high the stakes had become. In England, Murdoch mirrored this strategy, creating a Super League with a £77 million broadcast deal through Sky Sports. The aim was to strengthen his influence over rugby league internationally, professionalising all clubs, switching the game to summer and transforming the domestic structure. Clubs received roughly £800,000 per season, with funds allocated to running costs, facilities and infrastructure, squad numbers, video referees for televised matches, and a salary cap limiting clubs to 40% of income on players were all introduced. Proposed mergers of historic rivals, like the 2 Hull clubs, met strong backlash, so expansion focused on new areas, including London and Paris. The first European Super League match was played in March 1996 in Paris, with PSG defeating Sheffield. Wigan, St Helens, Bradford and London battled in the playoff for the Premiership final. With Wigan beating St Helens at Old Trafford, Andy Farrell won the Harry Sunderland Award back-to-back before the playoff and grand final format was introduced in 1998. Back in Australia, the dual ARL and Super League competitions caused confusion. Fans were split, attendances dipped, TV ratings stagnated, and revenue fell. Eventually, a peace deal merged the two leagues into the National Rugby League, NRL. With the initial 20 teams competition unsustainable, clubs would be reduced to 14 ahead of the new decade. Some clubs merged, including the St George Dragons and the Illawarra Steelers, to form the St George Illawarra Dragons. Meanwhile, some clubs were deemed not up to standards and excluded, like the South Sydney Rabbitohs, who were a founding member back in 1908. The NRL consolidated TV deals between Pay TV, Foxtel and Optus Vision, and free-to-air Nine Network, and introduced a salary cap to prevent overspending. The inaugural NRL season crowned the Brisbane Broncos as premiers, coached by Wayne Bennett, captained by Alan Langer, with Darren Lockyer emerging as a star. The Auckland Warriors joined during this period, creating a professional pathway for Kiwi players. The Dally M Award became the official Player of the Season accolade after the Rothmans Award was discontinued due to cigarette advertising bans. Andrew Johns won the first two Dally M Awards, later claiming a third in 2003, cementing his status as one of the sport's all-time greats. The start of the 21st century brought optimism and ambition for rugby league, beginning with the 2000 World Cup. The tournament expanded to 16 teams, including emerging nations such as Russia, Lebanon and the USA, and was hosted in the UK. However, it proved a financial disaster. Australia dominated on the field, and lopsided matches with poor attendance left the event losing £2 to £3 million. The fallout was severe enough that the scheduled 2004 World Cup was called off. Meanwhile, the NRL firmly established itself as the premier rugby league competition. Kiwi star Sonny Bill Williams burst onto the scene for the Bulldogs, thrilling fans with his athleticism. In 2002, South Sydney made a dramatic return to the NRL after being initially excluded for not being a viable club. Legal action, backed by passionate fan support, ensured the country's oldest club was reinstated. The 2000s also saw the emergence of entertaining new stars. Benji Marshall's Brilliance helped West Tigers capture their first NRL premiership in 2005, producing one of the most iconic players in rugby league history. Later in the decade, Jonathan Thurston and Greg Inglis would lit up the competition. Meanwhile, the Melbourne Storm grew into a powerhouse. Their big three of Cronk, Slater and Smith guided them to 4 grand finals in a row from 2006, winning in 2007 and 2009, though these would later prove to be controversial. But before that, there was a huge controversy in 2002. The Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs were caught in a high-profile salary cap scandal. The club had systematically breached the NRL's salary cap, resulting in them being stripped of all competition points for the season and fined heavily. The 2000s cemented State of Origin as the pinnacle of rugby league in Australia, surpassing the Ashes in intensity and profile. The series grew in every aspect, and Queensland frequently edged New South Wales during this decade as Origin truly established itself as a must-watch sporting event in Australia. In 2003, the Ashes series came to an end. All 3 games were fiercely contested, but Australia completed a 3-0 clean sweep. The defeat marked a decline in the relevance of the Great Britain brand, and it would be more than 2 decades before the Kangaroos returned to the UK for another Ashes tour. In the Super League, a Big Four emerged. Bradford Bulls were early dominators, not just in Super League, but in the World Club Challenge, with stars like Stuart Fielding, Jamie Peacock and Leslie Vainicolo leading the charge. St Helens rose as another powerhouse, guided by Paul Sculthorpe and emerging talents Sean Long, Paul Wellens and Kieran Cunningham, trading grand final victories with Bradford in the early 2000s. Leeds Rhinos became dominant toward the end of the decade, with academy stars Kevin Sinfield, Rob Burrow, Jamie Jones-Buchanan and Danny Maguire leading the club to a hat-trick of grand final wins in 2007, 2008 and 2009. And Wigan Warriors would return to the top in 2010, winning their first grand final since the inaugural Super League season. And to this day, only these 4 clubs have claimed a Super League grand final. France returned to Super League in 2006 with Catalan's Dragons, following the failed PSG experiment. Backed by the RFL and given 3 seasons exemption from relegation, Catalans were intended to help regrow the game in France. The Magic Weekend was also introduced, with all fixtures played at a single venue over a weekend in locations like Cardiff, Manchester and Newcastle, a concept later adopted by the NRL in the 2020s. Financial challenges persisted, leading the league to scrap promotion and relegation in 2009 in favour of a licensing system aimed at raising standards, improving facilities and developing academies. The Rugby League World Cup returned in 2008 after an 8-year hiatus, hosted by Australia to celebrate 100 years of the game in the country. In a thrilling final, New Zealand upset the Kangaroos, coming from 16-4 down at half-time to win 34-20, becoming only the third nation to lift the World Cup and ending Australia's long-standing dominance. The 2000s also saw early formal steps in the women's game. Competitive club fixtures and representative matches began to emerge, laying the foundations for the later establishment of the NRLW. Meanwhile, Wheelchair Rugby League was in its infancy, with small competitions starting to appear in the UK, introducing a new, inclusive branch of the sport that would grow steadily in the following decade. The 2010s were a decade of turbulence and transformation for rugby league, with contrasting fortunes between England and Australia. In England, the game suffered from falling attendances and declining TV audiences, while constant league restructures exposed the instability and short-term thinking of administrators, who seemed to change the format every few years in a bid to reignite the sport's fading flame. Clubs grew increasingly dependent on wealthy backers, but even historic giants weren't safe. Both Bradford and Widnes fell into administration during the decade, suffering relegation from Super League and slipping into part-time status in the Championship. Expansion side Celtic Crusaders met a similar fate. Granted a Super League licence for the 2009 season, they entered administration just a year later, and by September 2011, their owners had withdrawn funding, forcing the club to fold altogether. The London Broncos also struggled, but survived thanks to the continued investment of long-time owner David Hughes. Relegated in 2014, they remained competitive at the top of the Championship, and in 2018, earned promotion back to Super League by upsetting the Toronto Wolfpack in the £1 million game. Toronto themselves were an ambitious transatlantic experiment. Backed by Australian businessman David Argyle, they entered League One in 2017 with big investment, blitzed the competition and climbed the ladder by signing Super League and NRL talent. After falling short against London in 2018, they bounced back to win the Championship Grand Final, sealing promotion to Super League. In 2018, Super League clubs broke away from the RFL to take greater control of their commercial revenue. The move came after frustration with poor sponsorships, most notably the Stobart deal, which gave the haulage firm League naming rights while receiving no direct cash, only League branding displayed on its lorries across the country. Despite turmoil off the field, there were standout moments on it. Leeds remained a dominant force, with Rob Burrow scoring a stunning solo try in the 2011 Grand Final and becoming the first unanimous winner of the Man of the Match award. Wigan won 4 Grand Finals this decade. Meanwhile, rivals St Helens won their second of the decade in 2019 and would go on to complete a 4-peat of Grand Final victories. Catalan's Dragons became the first non-English side to win the Challenge Cup in 2018. Yet the league's honours were still largely monopolised by St Helens, Wigan and Leeds, with Warrington, Castleford and Huddersfield challenging but unable to break through. Many of England's brightest stars, including Sam Burgess, James Graham and Josh Hodgson, departed for the NRL, where they went on to become household names in Australia. But the NRL decade began under the shadow of Melbourne Storm's salary cap scandal. Their 2000 titles were stripped, fines exceeding $1.6 million were imposed, and CEO Brian Waldron was banned, with all 2010 season points deducted. The Storm rebuilt under Craig Bellamy to win 2 further titles, while the South Sydney Rabbitohs ended a 43-year premiership drought in 2014, led by Sam Burgess and Greg Inglis. Jonathan Thurston cemented his legacy with a dramatic drop goal in the 2015 Grand Final, also winning his 3rd and 4th Dally M medal in 2014 and 2015, overtaking Andrew Johns and becoming the first player to win the medal 4 times. The Roosters won back-to-back titles in 2018, winning their 3rd of the decade after defeating Manly in the 2013 Grand Final. Paul Gallen captained the Cronulla Sharks to their first title in 2016, 2 years after the Cronulla drug scandal, where head coach Shane Flanagan was suspended for a year. The club fined $1 million and several players faced bans, prompting tighter NRL supplement regulations. State of Origin became Australia's premier sports series in the 2010s. Each 3-game series drew record TV audiences, with individual games often exceeding 2 million viewers nationally. Queensland dominated this decade with 7 series victories, with Cameron Smith winning 3 Wally Lewis medals. The 2010 Queensland win was the first 3-0 series win since 2000, and a whitewash win hasn't been seen since this victory. During this period, Indigenous and Polynesian players rose to prominence, sparking a major shift in the international game. The turning point came when Jason Taumalolo pledged his allegiance to Tonga, inspiring fellow stars like Andrew Fifita to turn their backs on Australia and represent their heritage nations. This movement strengthened Tier 2 nations and dramatically increased the depth and competitiveness of the international stage. Australian Supercoach Wayne Bennett took charge of England for the 2017 Rugby League World Cup. After Tonga stunned New Zealand to top their group, defeated Lebanon in the quarterfinals, they pushed England to the brink in a dramatic semi-final. England advanced to face Australia in the final, but fell short in a gritty 4-0 defeat, a match remembered for Josh Dugan's game-saving ankle tap. Bennett later oversaw the revival of the Great Britain Lions on their 2019 tour of the Southern Hemisphere. But after losing all 4 matches, the tour was widely branded a disaster, and the Great Britain name was quickly shelved once again. The Australian Rugby League Commission was established in 2012 as an independent governing body with the goal to control the strategic direction of the game in Australia, also negotiating a TV deal valued a little over $1 billion Australian dollars. The women's game took a huge step forward in 2018 with the launch of the NRLW, beginning as a 4-team competition and expanding rapidly to 12 clubs by 2025. The State of Origin also gained full recognition in the women's game, replacing the old Women's Interstate Challenge banner, though it remained a 1-game series at first, with New South Wales winning the opening 2 clashes heading into the new decade. In the UK, the women's game was also gathering momentum, with the Women's Super League established in 2017, providing a professional structure and helping raise the profile of the game with increased television coverage. 2020 brought Rugby League its biggest crisis since the Super League war, as the pandemic threw sport into chaos worldwide. Under the leadership of ARLC chairman Peter V'landys, the NRL became the first elite competition in the world to return after suspension. New rules, including the 6 again, injected greater speed and intensity into matches, and the game enjoyed a surge in TV ratings and digital engagement. In the UK, the sport was hit hard. A £16 million government loan kept clubs afloat after the shutdown in March, but newly promoted Toronto Wolfpack received no support. Just months after signing dual-code superstar Sonny Bill Williams on a $10 million deal, the club withdrew and collapsed. The disrupted season saw the grand final moved from Old Trafford to an empty KC Stadium in Hull, where young Jack Wellesby etched his name into history by scoring after the final hooter to snatch victory in one of the most dramatic finishes the sport has ever seen. As the sport rebuilt, Super League realigned with the RFL and entered a 12-year partnership with global media giant IMG. The deal reshaped the competition, a rebrand, new overseas TV agreements, the launch of Super League Plus, and the return of licensing, with traditional promotion and relegation once again scrapped. The league also renewed its long-standing broadcast deal with Sky Sports, but the 2024-26 contract represented a major drop, from £40 million per year to around £22 million. On the field, the decade has already produced historic moments. Leigh rebranded as the Leopards and, led by Adrian and Lachlan Lamb, lifted the Challenge Cup in 2023 and became regular playoff contenders. Hull KR ended a 45-year wait for silverware in 2025, winning both the Challenge Cup and the League Leaders' Shield. Wigan Warriors capped it all by being named the UK's Sports Personality Team of the Year after an incredible quadruple, which included defeating NRL heavyweights Penrith Panthers in the World Club Challenge. The Panthers themselves have become the defining force of the NRL. Guided by father and son duo Ivan and Nathan Cleary, they rebounded from a 2020 grand final loss to Melbourne to claim 4 consecutive premierships, with Nathan establishing himself as the best player in the world. Yet despite Penrith's dominance, the Dally M medal has had 5 different winners from 5 different clubs this decade, a sign of the NRL's growing depth and elite quality. V'landys has also driven Rugby League's push into the American market. In 2024, the NRL staged its opening round in Las Vegas, drawing 40,000 fans to Allegiant Stadium in a groundbreaking event. Its success ensured a return in 2025, expanded to include 2 NRL fixtures, a Super League match and a women's test, with rising attendances signalling momentum for further growth. This decade also sharpened the focus on concussion and player safety, with the sport facing growing scrutiny over head trauma and mounting legal challenges from former players. Looking ahead, Rugby League appears primed for growth. The NRL is planning expansion into Perth and Papua New Guinea, while international International interest in the product has never been stronger. In the UK, IMG's influence has driven higher attendances, improved viewing figures, and created a more competitive Super League, with the chance of a fifth club finally adding its name to the trophy. The big questions for the decade remain: can the NRL crack the American market and cement itself as the undisputed #1 sport in Australia? Will Darren Lockyer's new ownership group spark a revival for the London Broncos? Could French Rugby League rise again, and will State of Origin remain the game's pinnacle, or can the international stage finally challenge its supremacy? Where do you see Rugby League by the end of the decade?